Welcome. We're glad that you're able to join us this morning to talk about allyship and ally as an action verb. I am very, very excited to welcome two of my friends that are awesome, and I'm so excited to have you guys hear from them. So Viva and Aubrey, I'm going to have them introduce themselves in just one second, but to kick off the conversation, I just wanted to share this quote from Carolyn Johnson, and this is really kind of a little bit of the beginning of the conversation of we need to have folks actually taking action and participating in this conversation and have continual participation. And Carolyn Johnson just did a podcast. I was listening to it yesterday, and this was one of the quotes that she had. We are looking for participation. We're not looking for perfection. And we'll talk more about that through this call, but just wanted to kick it off with that. Now, if I can get this to move. I'm going to introduce the two other fantastic people that are joining us today. And while I'm introducing them and throughout this chat, the chat window is open. So if you want to, have any comments, questions, etc. And then we also have the Q&A open as well. So if you have questions, go ahead and pop it in there and we'll work those in as we're kind of working through the rest of the questions today. So first, I would like to introduce Viva Asmelash, and she is with Galileo Learning, and she's doing her side hustle as an inclusion strategist and consultant. So Viva, would love for you to introduce yourself.
And thanks so much, Katie. Happy to be here with you and of course with Aubrey as well. My name is Viva Asmelash, as Katie mentioned. I have been with Galileo Learning for the past close to 7 years. Most of my background is actually in recruitment marketing, and I'm currently an associate director of people operations, focused on employer brand, and also I'm the co-lead of our internal inclusion and diversity initiative, which is still going strong after several years. So we're really excited about that, and just happy to be here and hopefully shed some light from a first person perspective, obviously from a racial and ethnic standpoint, and also hoping to learn more from my queer colleagues and professionals on the call as well.
Awesome, thank you. And Aubrey Blanche, would you like to introduce yourself?
Sure. So hey everyone, I'm Aubrey. They call me the math path because I am both a math nerd and a deep empath. And my day job is that I'm the director of Equitable Design and Impact at Culture Amp. So I've just been at Culture Amp about 4 months. But before that, I spent 5 years sort of building and scaling Atlassian's diversity and belonging programs and structures. So deep education there. And then I think, I come to the work, I'm a big belief in moving from what we call D&I to equitable design. So the idea of like counting heads and pretending to want to care about Black people to actually designing spaces where everyone can thrive. Is really my big passion, and I do that across sort of talent programs, communications, and then I also work on algorithmic bias and products. So that's me. Identity specifically, I identify as a queer Latino woman, although I think there's a specific nuance in that I am a white passing woman of color, so I have a little bit, obviously, from the queer community, but also being able to actually live on kind of both sides of the race line. In ways that I think gives me a specific perspective. So hopefully that's helpful to folks on the call today as well.
Awesome, thank you. And for those of you who don't know, I'm Katee Van Horn. I lead VH Included Consulting and Coaching. I have had this consultancy for about 3 years and work on diversity and inclusion strategies for organizations and really help them to make diversity, inclusion, and belonging real in their teams. And so that's what I do. Prior to that, I was with GoDaddy and helped them to build their D&I program as well. And I'm your straight ally on the call, straight white female ally on the call. And so get to bring these two incredible women with us as we talk through some of these topics. Know that these topics are uncomfortable, and especially knowing, kind of what's going on right now in the world. We want to be thoughtful about that, but we also want to have a very frank conversation with folks. So thank you for joining us. And I'm going to jump right in here. Oh, all right. So when we talk about allyship or being an ally, would love both of your perspectives on allyship being a verb and not a noun. Aubrey?
I'm gonna give Viva the floor first.
Oh, okay.
As both symbolic and because I want to hear what she has to say. But I want to, for folks on the line, the reason I'm doing that is because I'm not the Blackest person on this call. And one of the things we need to do is make sure that we first prioritize what Black people have to say in this moment.
I appreciate that from both of you. Well, when we think about racism specifically, I think it's important to, and this is part of why I didn't introduce myself as like a queer ally on the call, because I think, you know, for someone to be deemed an ally, it's really important that the marginalized group considers them as such versus being self-proclaimed. And so I just think that that's really important. And so just thinking about this question, I love that you have framed it, Katee, in the way that's like, what is active allyship, or what is, I like to think about it too as like dismantling racism specifically, right? Which begins first with understanding really the specific characteristics of what white supremacy culture is and how it shows up, and then seeking to be really actively anti-racist, which a lot of people I think are talking a lot about now, but I think, you know, part of, the three of us chatted yesterday, and part of what that means really, and came up in that conversation, is that takes daily intention, and that's a practice and a muscle that needs to be flexed. And so I think that that is so important when we talk about active allyship and what that really means. Specifically, you know, one of the things that came up in our conversation yesterday was really this idea around strengthening a muscle around being able to sit with discomfort and what that really means. And the way I think about that is that, you know, even that rush to action is actually, that is a symptom of white supremacy culture, like needing to make something happen right away and expecting results right away. And so I really think that sometimes the rush to action can be really a coping mechanism and something that people do to numb from the reality that they are now like experiencing or for some people waking up to. And so I think it's so important to both act, but also be like really processing along the way. And I like to think about it as like that moment of realization, like when that light gets flipped on, to taking the action, like the space in between those 2 points is really where so much learning happens. And that is where true empathy is developed and deepened, is like through that processing and sitting with that discomfort. And so I just want to make sure that people don't skip over that, because that is such an important component of being an active ally, right? Because that fuels all of the actions to follow.
Awesome. Thank you, Viva.
Yeah.
Aubrey, anything to add?
I want to both like add something to that, because I'm like, yes, you know, I think that's really the key of it. And then I want to talk about, like, it's weird, I want to talk about Katee. But the first thing I want to say is it was implicit in what you said, which is if you're doing it right, it's painful. And I want to be really upfront with folks about that. Like, if you're doing it right, you should be feeling hopefully not shame, but probably. So learn how to pull apart the difference between your shame and your guilt. If you don't know what it is, shame is I am a mistake, guilt is I made a mistake. And what we want to get to is I am an anti-racist person, and I demonstrate that by doing anti-racist things. And so what we're really looking at is, once we have that space of awareness, like Viva said, how can our action be to sit with the pain? Because that's the way that we develop a deeper understanding of the people we're trying to support and their life experiences. So and then I want to talk about what this language around accomplices is coming out. And I think it's a useful framework I want to offer to people, which is, Katee, yes, we do say that like the term of ally is granted by the group you're supporting. But I actually, Katee, think you're not an ally. Like, I consider you an accomplice. And what I mean by that is, over the years that I've known you, not just in public spaces like this, right, where you're on the hook to put the right number of people with the right identities on a Zoom, but like in the background, in emails, when no one was ever gonna see it or give you credit for it, you obviously and explicitly create space for queer voices, for voices of color. And like, that's the shit that counts, is when no one gets to see it, you're never gonna get credit for it. And so I want you to, like, I wanna offer that to the folks on the call, is like, you're not just an ally because you've invited us here. It's the 100,000 other things no one ever has seen that you've done behind the scenes. And that's the difference between an ally and accomplice, or sort of this performative versus actual ally. So like, thank you, but I also wanted it to be a broader lesson.
Yeah, thank you for making me like get choked up on, on this. And yes, I want to hug you too when I know we can't right now.
No, right? Also, that's the other thing. Most D&I folks like need a hug. Oh,
Yeah.
Really quickly, someone just asked the difference between shame and guilt. So I want to repeat that because it's really important. So one, Brene Brown is useful. I have found the way she explains this helpful. Shame equals I am a mistake. Guilt equals I made a mistake. And I think that's actually the difference. People say, I'm not racist. I don't give a shit about your identity in relation to racism. I give a shit about your actions. So not, I'm not racist, but either I practice or I don't practice anti-racism. And there's no, it's an either or, a binary option. You either do or you don't. So offer that as well. Like, the belief that you're not racist, especially among white and white passing folks, is the #1 thing that oppresses Black people. Because the people who can do something don't.
I think that's so important. I love that so much, Aubrey. And like, one of the things that I think a lot about too, when it comes to anti-racism, is really that it's like action by action, moment by moment. It's like, it's like, it's almost like phrase, like, I am always striving to be anti-racist, you know what I mean? Because it is so, we're confronting these topics at every turn, I think. And we've all, if we have like been educated in the American school system, especially, we have all internalized some degree of this, and our lens is so a filter. It has this, you know, it has this like glaze over it that through which we experience everything. And so I think it is so important to also let people know that that is such a daily intention, what you're talking about, right?
Absolutely. So you mentioned accomplice, and first of all, thank you. The question that I think we should think about or talk about is, people probably don't even know, what does that mean? What is an accomplice or co-conspirator versus an ally?
I'm happy to talk about that. I know, and I've had some conversations recently about these two specific terms, accomplice or co-conspirator is another one, right, that we hear a lot. And whether that's the right term, because maybe it might have some negative connotations for people, or like, what does that really mean? And I don't know, I'm somebody who believes that like, words are just words. We assign meaning to the words. So unless we're taught, I want to say the exception to that is something that anything that's been historically wielded to impose trauma on people, right? That's a different discussion. But I personally don't feel that this, I don't have strong feelings about what this degree of activism is called. I actually think that when people get hung up on what the words are, it is a distraction from really what the core issues are that we're talking about. And it is either consciously or subconsciously a means of deflecting the conversation away from what we really mean. And so for me, what those words really carry is like that degree of personal risk taking in some way, right? And that to me is the difference between being like a more passive like ally, like I stand next to you, versus I'm the person that's going to stand between you and the police. Like that is the image that comes up for me when I think about who an accomplice or a co-conspirator is like, I am going to step up, and I know that is a very not all of us have, are in a position where we are standing up in front of someone in the police every day, right? But what does that mean in our daily lives? Like, what does it mean to intercept a microaggression when we see that happening? Or like, that is that degree of like, oh, this is, however uncomfortable this is for me in this moment, I know that it is more uncomfortable for the person that is on the other end of this. And so how am I going to step up and intercept and risk some degree of personal comfort in the process? And so that's how I think about those words.
Awesome. Thank you.
I love that. I wanted to link, Viva, what you just said with a question that I think it's Cara. Excuse me if I didn't get that name correct. It's really pretty. I like it. But it says, talk more about what it means to actively engage in anti-racism versus the blanket statement, I'm not racist, which I think is really related to what you were saying, Viva, this idea of like, who gives a shit what you call it on some level, as long as you do the thing. And I think related to Reed's question in the Q&A about why do I need to feel it, I can put in things like structured interviews, anonymizing resumes. So I want to be clear that those are some tactics to remove some unconscious bias, but I fundamentally believe that if we don't feel it, we are not capable of identifying the 100x more impactful conscious bias that no one's wanted DEI professionals to talk about. So I want to be really clear. I'm done with unconscious bias. I'm done with people not taking responsibility for the racist impact of their actions, regardless of their intent. But when we say practicing anti-racism, my personal journey, which is very weird and twisty for a lot of reasons, but the number one thing that's been effective, which I think Viva shared, is this sitting in and thinking about every area of my life. So I could list off, even I went for a bike ride on Saturday because I'm needing endorphins. While I was biking, I noticed on a bridge that a Black woman had just been pulled over by the police. Now, it is literally my personal anti-racism practice. Anytime I see a Black person interacting with a police officer, I pull my car over, I stop my bike, and I simply stand with my camera in front of me and I record. And I don't engage with those individuals unless I'm welcomed into the interaction, but I stand there in view of the Black person and make eye contact with them so they know that I am watching and that I am observing that interaction. Now, I do that because even though I'm a person of color, I appear white and I believe that my danger in that situation is significantly less. And I recognize taking a partial risk, but I know that I'm mitigating a significantly larger risk for one of my fellow human beings. So when I say anti-racism and why you need to feel it, it's because if you just do it at work, it's not good enough. And I know no one wants to hear that, but it's the truth. How do you think about where you buy your household goods? How do you think about observing the police in communities where you know that they murder people for no reason? How do you take in feedback from people when you find out that you've done some racist shit? And then also, when do you start talking to your kids about race? Because I guarantee you, every family of color started before their kids were 3. So if you're not starting before you're 3, you're behind. That's okay. There's still resources to catch up. But I wanted to share that. Again, don't glorify me for doing the thing. It was someone else's idea and I took it. But I just want to share that, like, that's what we mean, is truly understanding that every facet of your life has been impacted by white supremacy, and you have the beautiful chance to choose something else, and you will change the world.
And if I could just add on to that, I think it's also in what I heard you say is, it's the personal reflection. It's the personal work that you need to do. So, as you mentioned, and Reed, thank you for your question. Yes, changing the policies, doing those things internally is very important. However, this is really also about how are you as a human practicing anti-racism? How are you as a human practicing being an accomplice or a co-conspirator? So thank you both. That was great. I want to just shift over to centering the marginalized, because I think this is something that, and even the 2 comments of fatigue and the discomfort after that, we had a discussion yesterday about, how do we make sure that we're truly not taking over the conversation, and would love to hear your thoughts on that. Viva?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a difficult thing for me to answer a little bit, if I'm being candid, because it feels fairly basic. It's like if the conversation it keeps revolving towards your discomfort, your guilt, your shame, sort of as Aubrey was talking about. I think I mentioned yesterday on the call, like, do whatever you need to do, just don't talk to me about, like, I don't need to be privy to you taking a break from this conversation, to you needing some time away. I think that those are all really valid things to be feeling. As we were chatting about, it's like, for a lot of people, I think right now is an awakening of sorts, and where some people might be questioning really the lens through which they see every aspect of their lives. And so that is intense. I recognize that. I can understand that. I affirm that. And at the same time, because it is so, I mean, for lack of it is offensive to people of color that have been living with this for so long and expected to show up to work every day and do the thing and like be gracious and smile and nod and like all of that, right? Like Brittany Packnett Cunningham, who I just really respect and admire, posted something the other day that said, you know, every Black person you meet is a miracle. And that, I really felt that. And so it is this thing around really doing whatever you need to do to process what is happening, but finding the appropriate, it's like time, place, manner, right? Finding the appropriate people to do that with, place to do that with, manner to do that with, et cetera. And so that's when I think about centering, I think about that a lot. And I will just share, you know, that we had an experience, as Katee mentioned, I work at Galileo and we're a summer camp company, and we're Bay Area based, and we have just the most incredible team that is really doing their best to work towards anti-racism. And we even had a moment of learning in our team meeting where we kicked off the meeting talking about like, and this is an all staff meeting, and it was like, where is everyone right now? And the conversation just naturally flowed right into this place of like people actually processing, honestly and candidly processing what is happening right now. And, you know, there were, myself included, 4 Black women on the call. And it was like, time out, like no, we actually need to do something different in this moment. And it was a really, I think for everyone on the call, it was a real moment of learning and reflection. And so I share that just to say that, you know, the learning never stops on this front, right? And what it means to be anti-racist and how we hold space for people.
Thank you.
I'll add like a slightly different flavor of things, which is I am getting a lot of questions right now about like, how should I reach out? And I'll share, I sent a text to a good friend of mine like 2 weeks ago, because I know that he has people taking care of him. And I said, hey, wanted to check in on you, but wanted to do it after the first wave of every white person who's ever met you. And it was a joke, right? Because we have this rapport, but I just want to tell you that like most Black folks, like every white person that has ever met them in the last 10 years, just randomly reached out. And so my guidance for folks, because they're trying to figure out what to do, because we're saying check in on Black folks, but like don't bother them too much because it's actually overwhelming and exhausting to have a bunch of people who didn't give a shit about you before suddenly care. So what I would say is that when you're reaching out to support people, do that in line with the depth of relationship that you currently have. So like, if you don't have a Black person to reach out to, that's a signal for you that you should sit, listen to Viva, and think about why that is and how you got there and what it would look like for you over the next 5 years to not be in that position. How are you going to engage? Is it through the PTA? Is it like, there's many things in your community. But I also want to speak out for a specific segment of folks and share my experience, which is that those of us who are people of color who look white, which is we're doing this dance right now of processing our own racial trauma, but also like, I will tell you, I'm not going to my Black friends to process that because they don't need to do it. So for white folks, and we struggle because like white folks don't specifically understand my experience either because they haven't been racialized in the same way. So for a lot of white folks, if you can think of passing folks and you're able to hold space for them, a lot of us are struggling right now. And like, I'm in the process of working with a lot of white Latinx folks to actually build a community specifically for those of us who pass, so that we have space to process, because for the specific reason that we are actually tactical weapons against white supremacy, but we have to be at our full capacity to do it. So that's an interesting wrinkle that I think doesn't get talked about. And the way I am thinking about that is, how do we give those people space to process that doesn't take away the open space for darker voices, and also doesn't ask darker folks who share parts of our identities to do that work for us. So I wanted to offer that. So if you are white, understand there are actually people in the like POC community that you are uniquely situated to help right now, because we can then help you, like we are the bridgers between those identities. And most of the folks I know are actually happy to do that, but we're stuck in it. Yeah, I guess that was it, is like reach out in an authentic way. If you can't reach out in an authentic way, make a way to change your life so that you can get there.
Awesome. Thank you.
And that doesn't mean you have to like move to another state, right? It can just mean like thinking about your social circles.
I love that, Aubrey. Yeah. I mean, I'll just add one small note because I know we need to move on, but I will just say, I think what you said is so powerful, because there is that group of people that is white passing that I personally can attest to, like just really having a challenging time holding space for as a Black woman, because I don't know where to put it, because our experiences are not the same. And I know that my experiences are even different from other folks in the Black community. And so I guess the one thing I'll add to that is, like, whenever you're reaching out, I find it so helpful when people say like, no responses, like, you don't need to reply to this. Mm-hmm. And that taking that off of my shoulders in some way, but knowing that I'm being thought of or considered is super helpful.
Yeah.
Awesome. Agreed. So I'm gonna add two of these questions together. So we have a question about being afraid to start the conversation with a family member around anti-racism, and knowing that there's going to be some defensiveness there, and then also so that would be one, kind of that personal family member, but then also how do you address some of that stuff at work? And next we're going to talk about community and kind of the more community wide, but let's start with personal and work. So
I'm
happy to answer work because I get paid to do this all day. So
right.
Like, this feels really within my remit. So one of the things I found is, this is really basic, use the feedback skills that you already have. So if you're into the radical candor framework, praise in public, criticize in private, and use the SBI model, situation, behavior, impact. Here is the winning solution for telling someone that they've done something racist. Katie, I'm using you as an example. Hey, Katie, do you have a moment for me to give you a piece of constructive feedback some point soon?
Of course.
Micro yes. I've gotten consent from Katie to tell her that she's done something problematic. Now we've moved into a corner of the office or a private Zoom. Try not to do this on Slack if you can avoid it, right? Feelings are real. High context for constructive feedback. Hey, Katie, I know how much it matters to you that you're an ally. Start with an identity affirmation as a good person. We're reducing their amygdala activation so they'll hear you. In that last meeting, I saw that you repeatedly interrupted Viva and she wasn't able to get her ideas out. And I think we all would have benefited from everyone's ideas. Would you be willing to be more mindful of that in the future, or can I support you in some way in doing that?
Yes, of course.
So we got a consent, we did it privately, we described the situation, the behavior, the impact on that person, and then we offered or asked if they were open to adjusting or what support they needed. So I've affirmed them as a good person, but also held them accountable for their behavior. Yes, I have written an entire guide on this. But so I offer that to folks, is like that framework is also good for all feedback that doesn't have to do with racism.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. So can we talk a little bit about, so we're deep on the anti-racism piece. Can we also just talk about that intersectionality between the anti-racism and then the LGBTQ community?
Yeah. I mean, we should really stop killing Black trans women as a country. That's my first opinion from an intersectional point of view. No, but I think that's true, is that we have to be thoughtful that, like, for example, I'm very high on the privilege pyramid in the queer community, from a socioeconomic point of view, from a skin color point of view, from like an access to power point of view. So yeah, I think there's something there. And the best way to like up your context to be able to give that feedback is to actually have relationships with humans from that community. Listen to them about what they struggle with, and then ask them how they would like you to support them in that. But I think obvious areas for this are considering the ways that people are gendered in the workplace. You know, making sure correct pronouns are used and that people are given feedback when they make a mistake, or given pink slips if they refuse to stop making mistakes. And again, inclusion is a job performance issue. And yeah, so I think there's that, which is first education, make relationships with the community, and then figure out how you can act, speak and act.
Awesome. Viva, anything to add?
I so appreciate everything you shared, Aubrey. First, just going back to radical candor, I want to put a tally mark next to everything that you said with radical candor. I think what is so powerful about that framework is really something that I appreciate, which is like starting from a level field of I'm sharing this because I care deeply about you and about what we're doing together. And I think that that is so powerful. So I think somebody was asking even about their family member. I tend to think a lot about what we're talking about through the lens of values. And I think that values are such an important place to start having these conversations, because it can be as simple or as nuanced as saying, you and I, you know, grew up in the same household, and I feel like this is I don't feel like what you're sharing is in line with the values that we grew up with, right? I feel that is, or however you want to frame that, but I think that values can be really powerful in that conversation, because that also reflects that bit about deep care. And I think that when it comes to, you know, I recognize that I'm not speaking from a first person perspective when it comes to the queer experience, and at the same time, have really done my best to listen to friends or people important to me really share this, this experience around potentially even experiencing racism either within the queer community, or not feeling like their perspectives are as valued or as top of mind, whether that has to do with either race or socioeconomic status. And so I think it is so important that when we have conversations like this, that we really are seeing a whole person versus just one aspect of their identity when we are engaging. And that's why I think it's so important what Aubrey said, because I think that is a thing that does happen when you actually get to know people, right? You start to experience them as a full human, and it makes, again, it's just another way to really develop and deepen empathy. So
I love that, Viva. And I would add to that. So you're talking about values, and I love that is how you're basing it, because I agree with you wholeheartedly. I think there's also a piece of this that is, there are values that some of us grew up with that we need to shift. And so it kind of goes back to some of the conversation we've already had of being uncomfortable with some of this stuff and processing it in whatever way we need to, because there are things that we're having to face that have been reality for us for a very long time. And I mean, I think we all can think through, hey, as we grew up within whatever community we were in, things that were said, things that were done that you go, wow, that is not okay. And shifting your values and being able to have that conversation. And that's the approach that I've taken with family members is, hey, I know that 5 years ago, 10 years ago, 15 years ago, whatever it is, we heard those things, or that's what we thought was right. But now we need to shift our perspective, and we need to shift who we are and what our values are. Because I think that's such a huge piece to it, is that we're continually growing, we're continually learning, which you both have mentioned. And none of us knows all the answers, but being able to kind of talk through these things and learn as we go is a great way to make change and to get better. I want to answer. Oh,
I
sorry.
had a macro point about like LGBT and BIPOC. It occurred to me as you were talking, and it's very non-tactical. It's like very conceptual, but I think is important, which is that I've talked to a lot of people over the last couple of weeks that are like really excited about this new push for anti-racism because they think it's going to happen kind of like the 5-year turnaround on queer rights in America. And I want people to actually understand the difference between those movements, because otherwise I think we set ourselves up to fail at what I think is our current project, which is that if you look at the organizations that politically led the charge and why public opinion flipped so quickly. So fun fact for folks who are political scientists like myself, the turnaround in public sentiment on LGBT rights in America is one of the fastest political and cultural social shifts that we've measured over the last 50 or 60 years. One of the reasons for that is because gay people are white men. Not all of them, but like some of them. And so gay folks showed up in people's families and forced them to deal with it. And race is fundamentally different in that, unlike you're like me and you're transracially adopted, like most people don't just have Black people pop into their families, except via marriage or adoption. And so it's really important to understand that within the LGBTQ movement, POC BIPOC are incredibly still marginalized. The queer community is incredibly racist in a lot of ways. And so I just want to acknowledge for folks that like, it's awesome that we've gotten on LGBT rights, but because of the social structure of queerness versus race, the difficulty and the personal responsibility we must all take is actually much higher. The queer community, we still have big dialogues about things like HRC is an incredible organization that's done a lot of things for a lot of organizations that have helped all of us, but also it's primarily, sort of driven by white men. What does that mean about their agenda? But also white men have power, so that's good. And so I want to offer this to folks so that you know that the experts who are deep in this space also tangle with all of these issues, and you're just learning about them. So that confusion that you're having will never go away, because that's the complexity of the work. But I wanted people to understand or not get like a false sense of optimism about what's required for that shift versus this one.
Awesome, thank you.
That's so important, Aubrey. I just will add one note to double down on something that you shared, which is that tied with, so many gay men being white men, right, is this showing up in families, but also this piece around socioeconomic status and that being so closely linked to, and what that means, in terms of income level, voting power, like all of those things that you were sort of alluding to. Yeah, very helpful.
Awesome, thank you. So I'm gonna ask, Virginia is asking, how would you structure a community-wide dialogue process on systematic discrimination? I
mean, I guess the thing that I would start with there is that's a great question and very layered, depending on what your top outcome is for that time. It's like, who is that conversation meant to serve? What is it meant to do? Like, I think that getting super specific and clear on your outcomes is so important, because that may impact who you invite into that space, how you structure the time. So for example, if you were having a conversation, and I think someone asked earlier, what would we have done differently in the staff meeting? Suzanne, thank you for that question. I think what we realized was just really understanding, taking into consideration the current climate and uprising and revolution, and how people were going to show up to that space, and how we could protect the most marginalized and vulnerable of our community, right? Which on that call happened to be the Black women or Black people that are members of our team, right? And so I think it is so important that whatever you're doing, that be part of your outcomes, is really being clear on whose experience you're prioritizing or amplifying, how they're protected during that time, or how you're holding space for them, either by pulling their experience to the front end of the time, right? And really making sure that the conversation is centered on the experiences of those that are directly impacted. So I think that there are, depending on what you're trying to do, there are a lot of things to consider.
Anything to add, Aubrey?
I would just say I'll give a couple of rules, which is I think there's a lot of like this idea of community-wide. I think the mistake is to assume that the whole community needs to have the same dialogue at the same time. So I don't want to give like hard and fast rules, but one thing that's really important is not to like make Black pain pornography for white people to like feel bad. And what I mean by that is like often we want Black people to like rip open their trauma so that white people can see it in real time. And like there's blogs written about that shit. We don't need to traumatize people this week. So I want to say that when you're thinking about what a community strategy looks like, you first need to say, what's the outcome I want to get to? And what are the different experiences and journeys groups of people within the community need to go on? And then construct the spaces around that. So like, I'm kind of spitballing this right now, but for example, if I knew, or I just did this exercise at Culture Amp, we're literally thinking about it in terms of white allies, non-Black POC allies, and Black folks. And the reason for that is because they had different experiences and journeys. Now, we did actually have a community processing session in the context of Camp Color for example, for our Black employees, and our Black employees decided themselves that they would let allies observe. So we gave the decision to them because the idea was we want to create space for you to process. You can do that on your own. You can do that with other allies of color. You have the right to decide who's in that room. When we ran that meeting, explicitly up front, we said, Black voices will speak until they no longer want to speak, even if we don't get to anyone else. Then we will open the floor to people who also identify as people of color, but not Black. And if we have time, we will allow space for white people to speak. We'll let white folks know that they're welcome to share support or reflections in the chat, but that we would like them to stay on mute. So I think that's it, is you have to think about what are the needs you're serving. And then with every choice you design about the space you're creating or the resources is who is it for and what do they need? And again, think about the difference between a dialogue, a learning, and a practice space. Dialogue is talking, learning is information sharing, and then practice is like working together on things. All of those will be important at different times. But so that's it. Who is it? And then what type of space are you creating? And then go from there.
Awesome. Thank you both. We have 2 questions and we're getting close to time, so I want to make sure we hit both of these. So David, I'm going to ask your question last, just because I think that'd be a great way to cap this. But Kara's asking, how do you recommend stepping into the arena of diversity, equity, and inclusion work within a company that's just starting with that work? As the only Black woman both in our corporate office and the company as a whole, I do experience fear in being asked to take this on and feel the need to hesitate in correcting those in leadership who I think are approaching this too fast in a way that's almost destined to fail. Viva?
Sure. I'm not sure who asked this question. I don't have the Q&A open, but I will just share that I can completely empathize with your experience. This was almost exactly what happened when Galileo launched our internal initiative. And it just so happened that I was really interested and desired to be a part of this conversation. And that is not true for every person, right? And so I think that first understanding if that is, it sounds like it's something that you, it sounds like work that you are interested in doing within your organization. I will just say that what comes along with that is, I want to kind of divide my answer into first thinking about you as a human and then also about the work, because as a human being, it's so important. I need to be so intentional about what hat I'm wearing and when I choose to speak up on something and when I don't. And so that is true for anyone from a marginalized, anyone in general, but especially people part of a marginalized group, and especially so when you are somebody that is doing DEI work. I think that Aubrey and I were chatting a little bit about this yesterday. It's challenging for me to know when I'm too far into something to speak up or to save space for myself. And so that is just something to just be aware of and just flex as a muscle and to practice. And so I will share that. And then I think that as Aubrey and I were just chatting about, it's really understanding what your outcomes truly are and making sure that that the organization is aligned around what the outcomes truly are. And I think sometimes people get hung up on this, like, oh, we want to hire 2.5 Black people this year. And it's like, it's obviously, when I talk about outcomes, it's that whole like Simon Sinek thing, like asking yourself why 7 times or whatever, like getting to the real why. Because as we were just chatting about, your tactics, your methods, whatever strategies you employ need to be in service to your actual outcome, to be hopefully an inclusive, diverse space. So what does that mean? Does that mean that your diversity statistics match, the demographics of the city that your office is in? Like, what does that really mean to you? And really getting to that. And I just also want to underscore that, because I think that people can really pigeonhole DEI work to be really just about hiring or recruiting, or just about marketing and who your consumers are. And if you're doing this the right way, it impacts every strata of your organization, every single department, every function. The accounting department should be looking at, who they give a credit card to and what are the stipulations for that. Like, there are just so many different things, right? And so I think being thoughtful, comprehensive, zooming out, and not rushing to action are like the most important parts of the conversation, and prioritizing your own self-care.
I'll add a little bit of a different perspective. I can be a little bit of a firebrand. So I want to acknowledge.
What?
I know, right? I mean, part of that's because I look white, and so I don't scare white people because I look like their grandkids. Like, just to be honest, right? That's called using your privilege for good. But I wanna talk specifically about the fact that diversity, equity, inclusion work should be compensated more than software engineering. Mm-hmm. Straight the fuck up. Because the fact is, fewer people have deep technical expertise in this space. So what I would say to you, I just dropped a couple of things in the chat, so I want to call that out, which is an incredibly brilliant writer at Culture Amp wrote an article that basically she wrote for the purpose of Black people giving it to others when they say, how can I help? She's like, here's a blog post of all my feelings. I'm not going to explain them to you. I strongly suggest you send that to leaders. I also shared a blog that I wrote called Can I Pick Your Brain About D&I? Because the thing is that, like, companies value knowing how to do finance and how to engineer software, but don't actually want to pay for D&I. So I think the first thing that I would tell you to do is use colonized language against itself, and say things like, I would love to be able to add these responsibilities within the scope of my role, and I'd love to discuss what remuneration would be expected, and also which duties I will be deprioritizing in service of this priority to you. Mm-hmm. So again, super professional, right? Saying, I would like clarity on the scope of my role and what you're asking, and I would like to discuss the market rate for that work. Because the fact is, I don't know your ethnicity, but I will just make an assumption that you identify as a member of the Black diaspora. In addition to doing that work, you should also describe the fact that you should receive hazard pay for the trauma that you will take on while doing that work. Mm-hmm. So if you would like me to tweet about that, so you can send my tweet to your boss, please tweet at me, and I will do that. I will lay down my white face under the bus. So
do it, Aubrey.
Someone else's opinion. That's literally the point. But I want to offer that as well, is like, internally at Culture Amp, for example, we are thinking about, because we're in a tight environment, we're offering additional career opportunities and executive access as compensation for people giving their perspective on their experience. So again, compensation can be sponsorship, access, money, vacation. So I just want to, like, the full range of compensation is available to you, but I think you should absolutely stand in your power that this is expertise, and your lived experience is also expertise, right? It's inherently white supremacist to not pay for skills that didn't come because you went to Stanford or something ridiculous. So I want, like, own that. And if you don't feel comfortable speaking directly for many reasons that make a lot of sense, I like changing things into questions. So my favorite way is to state an assumption that you know that they don't believe, but once they say it, they can't disagree. So I know how much you want to value the work of Black people as a part of this. So help me understand how you've thought about how you'll compensate me for this. So actually go on the offensive and state that something is true. It might not actually be true, but now it's on them to tell you that they haven't done that work, which nobody wants to do. So I want to offer that to you as like a tactic of state what is true in the world that you believe should be true, and then ask people to bend their realities to that.
Awesome. And we will be sharing the social media handles for both Viva and Aubrey and myself in just a bit. And they're both very sassy on social media, so you will like it. And the last question, it kind of goes to that box on the bottom, you know, the concern about the momentum being lost. And so David asked, for many who focus on D&I issues, this is a lifelong effort to create change. For others, recent waves of change will subside. What's your sense of how long public energy will stay focused on D&I issues?
It's so interesting because I often, I've chatted with friends or colleagues around the fact that we are in the midst of a pandemic at the same time that this revolution is happening. And I sometimes wonder about how this all would have landed, or what the conversations would have been if we were not in the midst of a pandemic, if we didn't have people, and maybe Katee, I can't remember if you and I had talked about that.
We did talk about that, yes.
And so that is really top of mind for me. And my hope, I think at the end of the day, I am an optimist. And so my hope is that that has really deepened people, that sitting with the discomfort, right, has really lasted longer than it might have if we weren't in the midst of a pandemic. And so my hope is that people's understanding or their proximity to this, like their learning has been expanded because of that. And so I think that it's really, you know, I guess the thing that I just really want to underscore is that, you know, we had chatted yesterday about this idea that like, this is a muscle that needs to be, I mentioned it, like needs to really be flexed and needs to be developed for people over time. And so I think that if you feel yourself kind of inching away or needing a break from that, like, that is understandable. And at the same time, like, know that if you are committing to this, that it is lifelong work, right? And something that I like to say a lot is that it is really about connecting to our own humanity in a really important way that I think is not only important for you, but is also important for like the way that you're modeling what it means to be a human in this world for younger people in your life. And so, so that was really verbose, and I hope people got, you know, took some things away from that, but those are my feelings on it.
Awesome, thank you.
My advice is like, yes, when is the public going to stop caring? Like yesterday, right? We live in an attention economy, but like my belief is I do follow the macro. I'm a structuralist. I watch the way that I think these things matter. But for folks on the call, I think the useful thing is you can choose to keep paying attention. Mm-hmm. So like, fuck the media. Become the person who talks about race at parties. Yeah. And I say this as the person who talks about race at parties. There's a lot of people who will not want to hang out with you. Decide whether you want to have that relationship in the same way that you used to. So there's a really incredible group of women. Literally, we literally talk about, we're like, I literally want to go to a party and talk about racism and structural oppression, because that is like where I live my life and think. Mm-hmm. And so I just want to tell people that we give up a lot of our agency by going, oh, well, the public isn't paying attention to it. Guess what? The public isn't going to your PTA meeting. The public isn't going to your HOA meeting where you're all voting, high Bay Area people, to block housing that's pushing disproportionately Black and brown folks out of Oakland. Like, the public isn't at your dinner table when your grandpa's saying something unokay. And now maybe you're going to make the decision that you can't change a 90-year-old person's mind, but you can say, I'm not going to stand in this room while you put those ideas into the air. I can't change your mind, but I can say I'm going to excuse myself from this situation. So I think that's the thing we all need to keep on, is that there are people who are going to forget and who are going to stop working. And you have the opportunity to decide which of those people you're going to be. And that is the most powerful thing in the world.
I love that. I mean, I think both of you are spot on in that the work never ends, and we need to continue having these conversations, and it's hard and it's going to continue to be hard, but we have to keep that momentum going. And, you know, Angela kind of jokes around that she is the most out lesbian in Arizona. And so she also is one of those people that likes to go to parties, and this is what you talk about when you go and have coffee. This is what you talk about. And I think we all need to be doing that. And we are going to make mistakes, and we're going to say things that are wrong, but continuing to have the conversation. And, you know, the question that came up about talking to your brother, those little things that you're helping them see, it's the, once you see it, you can't unsee it. And that's what we're also trying to drive, is that awareness from everyone of, here are the things that you need to be aware of that maybe you weren't in the past. And it's okay that you weren't, but now you know. So now you need to do better. So I think those are the things also that keep coming up in my mind as I'm having conversations with people. So
can I add just a couple of things, and I'll make them
of
quick?
course.
I love that so much, Katee. And like, I think that as humans, we struggle with this, like what Aubrey was talking about earlier, and like that shame and guilt piece. And I think that like all things can be true at the same, like several things can be true at the same time, right? Like you can be a person that is experiencing joy and is hopeful, and also can be deeply saddened and disturbed by the realities that people are experiencing in our society. And so I would just, I guess, like make space. I would just tell people to make space for all of those things, and like wherever you are in that is like, okay, if you have a sense of like where you're going, right, with it. And the other thing, somebody asked specifically about kids, and I want to just make a plug for this because this is something that I've been wanting to say forever, which is that it's so important as parents and as people that guide young lives and souls, is like, it's just make sure that they have access to the experiences of others. And so if that means buying books that are not, and I think right now there's a lot of discussion around like making sure your kid has like whatever anti-racist book and like that type of stuff. And that is so important. And at the same time, it's really important to just have like books about Black kids that are just really like kids that are out on adventures and like living their, you know, and I just think that making sure that there is a spectrum of stories being told to your kids is so important. So I just wanted to flag that.
Can I add one more point? I'm sorry.
Yes.
Which is also, if you
guys are killing me, but yes.
if you buy the books with the queer people or the brown folks in them, but you actually don't know any brown folks, your kids will pay attention to your actions more than the books you bought them.
Oh, amen. Yes, absolutely. Okay, so thank you both. I adore both of you. As you know, I appreciate you joining us for this conversation. You know, One Community obviously is an amazing group, and we're so happy that they've asked us to have this conversation. Please remember that on Thursday, there is the Business of Inclusion panel discussion, which should be amazing. Thank you all for joining us. And our contact info is here on the slide. Please feel free to reach out, and we appreciate you joining us today. So thank you so much.
Thanks, everyone.